Welcome, and I'll start to share the screen. And all right. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And we are back here. We actually made a marking. There it is. Good, good. All right. So remember, they're about to come to Egypt, and I was meditating a little bit on yesterday's lesson. With that very, very racist kind of statement being made in the Rashis. And that brings me to something that I've shared with all of you quite a while ago, which is the something that's very helpful, and it's a statement in Pirkei Avot that says that there are four kinds of students that sit before the wise, that are symbolized by a sponge, a funnel, a sifter, and a strainer. Some of you probably remember this, but I'll review it just for a second because I think we had an example of what I was talking about at the time. So the sponge absorbs everything, just everything. And the funnel is in one end and out the other, doesn't retain anything. And then a sifter sifts out the fine flour and leaves out the bran, does not include the bran. And the strainer lets all the good stuff out and retains the dregs. And so what struck me about the statement in Pirkei Avot is that it says very clearly that there is something that you could call dregs or bran in Torah. That you have to apply a level of discrimination and to be able to discriminate all the good parts, which of course are incredibly many, from those parts that are not something that you want to retain. You don't want to necessarily retain everything or apply everything, or absorb everything or internalize everything. And that little piece of Rashi, which at the time might have been understood in its context, but nowadays just really, it's not very good. It's not something that I'm proud to translate for all of you or for anybody. I don't personally believe that kind of racism. I don't believe in that. And but nevertheless, it's there, and we have to apply our ability to discriminate all the wonderful, wonderful pieces of Torah from little pieces like that. And of course, it wasn't in the Torah itself, although there are things, we have discussed these sorts of things. There's genocide, essentially, in the Torah. At least that's the way it's presented. But at least within the Torah, it's quite possible that we are speaking in generalities and not in specifics. So without wanting to go into that a lot more, I did feel it was important for me to mention today that little piece that we were dealing with yesterday, and now I'd like to continue. So, we're heading down to Egypt. Abraham is worried that they are going to see Sarah, that they're going to be absolutely bowled over with her beauty, and that they're going to kill him because they know he's her husband. Wouldn't be the first or last time such things have happened. This is certainly well within, areas of belief. This is not incredulous. We don't have to have any incredulity regarding this. All right. Vahi kavu Avram Mitzrayma, and so it was when Abram came to Egypt. Vayiru hamitzrim et haisha. The Egyptians saw the woman. Ki yafahi, because she was indeed extremely beautiful. In other words, they might not have paid attention otherwise, but they certainly did on account of her amazing beauty. So, let's go into the Rashi here. Vayhi kevo Avram Mitzrayim. So this may have struck you, may have already picked up a certain strange expression here of the language, the way the language is expressing it, but it says, V'haya lo lomar. So Rashi is saying that the scriptural text should have said, I mean, he's just been talking to Sarah, and now all of a sudden it's just Abram. So the text should have read, Kevoam Mitzrayma. It should have said, when they came to Egypt, not when he came to Egypt, singular. It should have been in the plural. So what do we infer? Relatively famous drush, Ela Lamad, so that we learn from this, so, or Lamed it could be, or learn from this, Shehitmin Ota Beteva, that he hid her, he placed her in a box, right? He tried to make sure they didn't see her. V'al yedei shetabu et hameches, and because they demanded the customs, right? He had to go through customs. Isn't that something? Ein mukdam umuchar batorah, right? This is not the application of this. What we're saying is that nothing is new under the sun. Ein chadash tachat hashamish, Ecclesiastes, right? Nothing new under the sun, because they went through the suitcases. They went through the boxes because they wanted to he had to pay customs, right? Patchu, they opened up the box, v'ra'u ota, and they saw her. So, so what's the point in some ways of this comment? Sorry, let me get out of here. Okay, is that on the one hand, he had asked her to do this, but the point of this comment is that he also tried to take other steps and not just simply depend on making her have to tell the story. So, onwards. Vayiru ota sare paro. So it wound up that the nobles of Pharaoh's nobles, saw her. So, the news spread. This gorgeous, gorgeous woman is here, and the word spread. Okay. And so the nobles of Pharaoh saw her, v'yahalalu ota el paro, and they praised her to Pharaoh. Vatukach ha'isha beit paro, and the woman was taken into the house of Pharaoh. Now, you may be reacting to the fact that she's not referred to as Sarah here, but simply as the woman. And it strikes me that quite possibly that is sort of a subtle implication of the sort of level of dehumanization involved in this. That instead of her being a person and a personality, that they were looking at her as an object and not as a person, and that the Torah is reflecting that in the writing itself. At any rate, let's keep going on. V'yahalalu ota el paro. So they praised her to Pharaoh. Halaluhu beinehem. They were praising her actually amongst themselves. They were reacting between themselves and discussing this amongst themselves. Lomar, and they said, by way of praising her, they simply said, Haguna zu lamelech. This one is worthy of a king. So out in that conversation, things happened. Ula Avram, Heitiv Bavura. And they did well. It went well for Abraham on her account, or he did well, right? Pharaoh did well to Abraham on her account. Vahilo, and so he had, this is Abram now, had son uvakar, he had sheep and cattle, v'chamorim and donkeys, v'avadim, men servants, ushvachot and maid servants, v'atonot ugmalim, so mules and camels. Let's see if there is Rashi on this. There we go. Ula Avram Heitiv. So it's interesting that Rashi says here, Paro, that Pharaoh was the one who did well. There's no subject to the word Heitiv. And so I'm wondering to myself, there's a whole book that's sort of entitled "What's Bothering Rashi?" In other words, if you're answering a question, the implication is there's a question that's being asked. So just to finish the translation, Pharaoh on her account. on her account. So the only thing I could come up with was that that did it mean God did well? That is Rashi clarifying that this wasn't necessarily that the Torah isn't coming to tell us that God, rewarded Abraham on this account, but specifically that Pharaoh did this on this account. So he's basically paying him a bride price for this, Pharaoh, because he's her brother. Okay. Here we go. Vayinaga Hashem et Paro. So on the one hand, Pharaoh, rewarded Abram, but on the other hand, Hashem afflicted Pharaoh, Nagaim Gedolim ve'et Beito, great plagues and his household and his house. Aldavar Sarai Eshet Avram, on account of, now we can translate davar as matter, but you'll see how Rashi and the tradition, and Rashi, of course, is simply reflecting how the tradition looks at it. But we know ledaber also means speak, right? So, but at any rate, the pshat would appear to say regarding the matter of Sarah, Eshet Avram, who was the wife of Abram. So I know that this raises all kinds of. Sorry, let's see if I can get this up. All right. That it raises all kinds of interesting issues about, well, here on the one hand, Pharaoh is rewarding Abram, and on the other hand, and of course he didn't know that Sarah was his wife, and on the other hand, God is still, taking it out on Pharaoh, and how's this justifiable? So the best I could come up with is that this kind of behavior is inappropriate. That regardless of the actual circumstances here and the fact that Pharaoh was ignorant, the fact is that that isn't what prompted this whole behavior. That the implication here is that lusting in this kind of way and using power in this kind of way, regardless, is absolutely something that is detestable. And
Rabbi,
yes, Harlan.
did Abraham have to give everything back to Pharaoh then?
No.
If that behavior was bad?
Nope. Interestingly enough, that was at least when Pharaoh rewarded Abram. At least that was something good. Okay, he was doing something good, and so that didn't get returned. You'll see. You're anticipating the story. So Harlan, hold off a little bit, because we'll answer that question, and then we can certainly try and discuss it a little further. Then, okay?
Sure.
All right. So we have to. I want to try and do things one at a time, and not try to anticipate too much. All right. I know we have in the past for sure. So here we go. Here's the thing. So how did Vayinaga Hashem v'gomer? So Hashem sent plagues, in other words, afflicted. So Rashi and the Midrash, right, supply specifics. That's a generality. God sent plagues. Well, what kind of plagues? Right. So here we go. B'makat ra'atan. The specific plague, affliction, was something called ra'atan. Okay, and I checked up Ratan, and it turns out to be, and Rashi will explain why it was Dafka Ratan, because it's an important principle of midah keneged midah, that justice is that the punishment fit the crime, right? If you've seen the Mikado, you know that there's a whole song about that, but that the punishment should fit the crime. So Ratan itself is nervous trembling, a certain skin disease attended with extreme weakness. Okay, so that's our understanding of Ratan. But Rashi's going to explain why this was an appropriate affliction on the part, a punishment for Pharaoh. So he says, B'makat Ratan laka. He punished him with this affliction called Ratan, shehatashmish kashelo, because in that particular case, it's very difficult, very hard to engage in intercourse. So that's why it became, because what was prompting this whole behavior now was this sexual lust. And so the punishment was you weren't going to be able to satisfy that sexual lust. But it also, understand, was a protection to Sarah, and I'm sure you inferred that very quickly, that this also protected Sarah. So what about this ve'et beito, right, which we certainly could translate his household? But so here he goes, ketargumo, as the Targum states, so his house, for al enash beito, which means the people in his house. In other words, his household. So beito, while it means his home, right? We should understand that what it means is his household. However, right? Look at the parentheses. Umidrasho, however the midrash is, lerabot kotlav v'amudav, that in fact it included, right? It was to come and include. This ve'et beito means it comes to include other things, but there's a midrash that says that it comes to include the walls, the amudav and its pillars, the kelav and the utensils, and he says Barashi Yashan in an old edition of Rashi. This is Rashi states this, which is interesting, right? What exactly are we talking about here? And of course, this stuff just prompts, if you want to think about it and say, what's the point here? And whether or not, is there a profound point? I don't know that I necessarily can come up with a profound point, but at least on the other hand, there is at least something here being suggested that how we behave has an incredible effect on the physical property that we have and on the physical world. That the physical world actually has so much to do with the spiritual world and depends on it. And I know it can also operate in the opposite way as well. Now we get to the al davar sarai, right? Which we said pshat would be, regarding the matter of Sarah. However, the word dibur we know also means speech, and this is where the midrash takes us. Al pi dibura, by means of her speaking, right? Her speech. Omeret la malach, she would say to the angel, hach, strike, vahu makeh, and the angel would strike. And this of course is saying some very interesting things about Sarah, right? And how the midrash looks at her as a brave, virtuous person, and clearly with incredible spiritual gifts, and the degree to which she adored and loved and was loyal to her husband. And I'm sure more can be said about it, but at least I'm trying to perhaps open a door to regarding this. So onwards we'll go to verse 18.
Hey, Rabbi,
Yes,
Eshet Chayil?
yes, we could definitely call her Eshet Chayil. Very, very good point. Right. She'd be an example of an Eshet Chayil. A woman of valor, literally, right? In ways that we never even thought of, right? So, Vayikra, so this is happening, right, in Pharaoh's household, and he's thinking to himself, there's obviously stuff going on, and it must have to do with what just happened, right? He's putting two and two together. Vayikra Pharaoh la'Avram. So Pharaoh summons, he calls Abraham, Vayomer, and said to him, Ma zot asita li. Interesting. He says, what did you do to me? What did you do to me? Lama lo higadata li. Why didn't you tell me, ki ishtecha hi, that she is your wife? Interesting, right? So Pharaoh has figured this out. He also, of course, has counselors, and they're putting two together and saying this kind of stuff happens, right, when there's adultery going on. Okay, this stuff. So, continues the question. Lama amarta, why did you say, Achotihi, she is my sister, va'ikach ota li leisha, so that I took her to me as a wife? Right? Now, he doesn't wait for Abram to answer these questions. They are rhetorical questions, and he says, Va'ata, and now, hine ishtacha, here is your wife, kach valech, take her and go. Take and go. So he doesn't ask for the gifts back. Okay, he's a fabulously wealthy person. He's got his pride, Harlan. I think to answer your very good question is that there's a certain level of pride involved in that, and that his taking back the gifts shows a certain pettiness, okay, on his part, and isn't becoming to nobility. So he doesn't. It would be actually sort of also, of course, it would be a major admission of the mistake he'd made, and I don't think he really would want to do that. So I think there may be other reasons as well, but he doesn't take back the gifts. And in this particular part of the text, it doesn't. There's going to be a second, of course, incident very similar to this, but in that particular case, Abram is going to say a little bit more. He is going to actually give an explanation. But here, no explanation is mentioned, and no explanation, at least according to this text, is sought. Pharaoh has his pride, and he just says, "You got to get out of here. I want you out of here." So, however, okay. So let's just see. Okay.
Was Abraham very wealthy before he went to Egypt?
Not as wealthy. He definitely comes out. There's nothing mentioned about his wealth prior to that. It is only after Egypt that it is mentioned. And remember, it was a test, right? He went to Canaan, the land of Canaan, just as God had commanded him. And as soon as he gets there, God sends this famine to a point where Abram has to reluctantly head down to Egypt. Okay. Of course, we understand the parallels, the literary parallels that are involved there, and would give us something to meditate on and think about it. Okay. So here we go. There's a nice Rashi on this. Kach valech, take and go. And now Rashi compares this to the situation with Avimelech. He says, Lo ka'Avimelech. This is a difference in the story, in this parallel story with Avimelech. She'amarlo, because Avimelech said to him, Hine artzi lefanecha. He didn't tell him to get out. He said, Behold, my land is before you. Ela amarlo kach. But he said to him, that is Pharaoh, said to him, Amarlo, Lech va'al ta'amud. And he said, Go and do not remain. Don't stand. Just get out of here ASAP. And Rashi explains why. Shahamitzriim, because the Egyptians, shfutei zimahem, they were engaged excessively in lewdness. And so we can either understand this as Pharaoh being smart and not wanting to bring divine punishment on the entire land of Egypt because he was figuring this kind of stuff is going to happen again. And this time, of course, they may not spare Abram. They might actually kill him, and that would be devastating. Just as a support for this statement regarding the Egyptians, Rashi quotes Ezekiel 23, V'zirmat susim zarmatam. I'm not certain of the vowels here, but basically it means there's the stream of horses is their stream. And of course, it's a euphemistic way of talking about, carnality and lewdness. So that's the support, that they had that reputation. So, and this may be a good place to stop. And we will put our marking in here. Let me go back and remove this. And if any of you would like to comment before I stop the recording, I'm happy to hear this. So we're right
Yeah.
in here. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering why God chose Abraham over everybody else. What was Abraham? Why did I can't? Of course, I can't say God can do that, but why did He do that? Why just Abraham? Why not his father? Why not his brothers? Why just
Right.
Abraham?
So I think that your question is in fact anticipated by the Midrash, right? You're right. The Bible doesn't say much about that at all. But we have these Midrashim that talk about Abraham's father being an idol maker and how Abram destroyed those idols, and basically when his father protested, and I realize it's a story and it raises other kinds of questions, but nevertheless Abram said, oh, it was the big idol that did it, and the father says, what are you talking about? And Abram says, well, how come you worship it? If you yourself admit that it's incapable of doing anything, why are you worshiping it? Okay, so that's one story. And then there's another story that Abraham came one day, he was meditating and he saw the sun, and he said, oh, the most powerful gift to human beings, I should worship the sun. And of course, the sun went down and then out came the night. And to make a long story short, Abraham concludes that there must be something transcendent behind all of this, behind all of nature. So the Midrash tries to suggest that that it wasn't simply that God chose Abraham, although there is a statement in the text itself that refers to God choosing Abram. But nevertheless, and we refer to that also in the Haggadah. But at any rate, there is some attempt to say that Abram came to this conclusion himself, that he himself was worthy of being chosen. But we'll see later on, there are other aspects. It wasn't simply a matter of theology, a matter of his coming to this conclusion as a personal philosophy. It also has to do with his subsequent behavior, which we will read about, of course, in the next Parsha of Vayera, where he shows hospitality to strangers. And
Do we
that's
know?
profound.
Do we know Abraham's life when he was born, all the way up to he was 75? What is that life? I don't know.
We
They didn't say.
don't have any details other than the fact that he goes along with his dad and that he
Oh,
married Sarah. We have
oh.
nothing else basically up to
Hmm.
that point, up to his age of 75. I had
I
a
wonder if
friend of mine who used to say, Abraham's a story that shows you that life begins at 75. By the way, he lived up to 175. He lived another 100 years. Let me I'm going to stop the recording here. I'm going to stop the share and stop the recording and thank those who joined us.